So welcome, thanks for coming. I'm going to dive into this topic. I talked a little bit about myself this morning, and I think David did a great introduction. So, this is a class that I did over a 6-week period, and each week we talked about a different movement. So I'm going to attempt to cover all 6 movements in our 2-hour period. So wish me luck. There's going to be lots of images in here. When I did it for the 6th week, it was really delving deeply into each movement and really exploring each of the characters that had a lot to do, meaning photographers, that had a lot to do with each of the movements. We're not going to be able to get into it in that depth. So, I was thinking, how do I present this in a 2-hour lecture? Well, what I really want to focus on and want you all to focus on for the lecture is just taking a look at visually the style of each movement, okay? Because that's the whole point of the class, is paying attention, learning a little bit of history of photography, first of all, but then paying attention to how visually the styles of each movement and era changed. And ultimately, how can we take those styles and infuse them into our own work? So I would hope at the end of the class, I won't probably be asking each of you, but ask yourself, what was my favorite movement? Was it the modernists? Was it the Russian constructivists? Was it the pictorialists? Because if you can identify which was your favorite one as far as visually, which one got you excited, then maybe you could pull some of those elements and put them into your own work, and then you might like your photographs that much more, okay? So just take a look at visually, since we can't get into super in-depth, but I'm gonna give you a bit of a timeline here. So it's important to think about a timeline when it comes to this. I'm not going to be throwing out a lot of dates and names at you, but these are the 6 movements that I've chosen out of the long history of photography that I think are really relevant. Some of them are purely photographic movements, like pictorialism and the California modernists, purely photographic, meaning you did not see this in painting or sculpture. Others are movements that were across the board, so we saw them in architecture or painting, and they weren't exclusively photographic. So we're going to talk about each one here. So here's our timeline. Photography was invented/discovered in 1839. We're going to talk about pictorialism and photo succession, which was the same era. We're going to move on to constructivism, Dada, and surrealism. Okay. Then, we're going to talk about straight photography. Now, some of these movements happened from here all the way to here. I mean, we still see straight photography today. We saw it heavily in the 60s, and we saw it back as early as 1916. So some of them might be a little, encapsulated time period, and others will span the incomplete 200 years of photography. Then we're going to talk about the California modernists, abstract photography, and then this huge hunk of time from 1970 on to now. So we have to talk a little bit about the beginnings of photography, really. So photography was invented or discovered in 1839. And the reason I'm showing you, these are the 3 big heavy hitters. These are the 3 guys who you're going to hear their names associated with the beginnings of photography. We often hear Daguerre because of the daguerreotype, okay, but William Henry Fox Talbot and Joseph Niepce were 2 other photographers/scientists who had a big hand in creating the medium. Now, why is this important to this lecture? Because photography had an identity crisis from the very beginning. Okay, there were 2 big questions that emerged from the beginning that still can be with us today. The first one is it art or is it science? Okay, it's both, really. It still is today. And the other question was, is it truth or is it fiction? Okay, still, we could talk about those today. And the reason I'm pointing out these quotes by these gentlemen is because I blame these guys, the inventors of photography, for some of this identity crisis, for some of this doubt. And from the beginning, there was a doubt that something so scientifically based in chemicals and scientific experiments and physics and chemistry could be a self-expression and an artistic form. And look at the way these guys talked about the medium from the beginning. Impressed by nature's hand. The daguerreotype is not an instrument which serves to draw nature, but a chemical and physical process which gives her the power to reproduce herself. Spontaneous reproduction by the action of light. Who's being left out in these quotes? The photographer, right? So I think that these guys unknowingly laid a foundation of this perception that photography could not be art or self-expression. So the first organized art movement in photography was pictorialism. So let's just take a look at what was happening right before pictorialism. Again, we had these dilemmas and debates happening. So because there was this doubt that photography could be art or artistic, there were quite a few early photographers who were pushing to elevate the medium to be accepted as art. I'm going to just breeze through these. Gustave Le Gray was actually the first HDR photographer. Okay, this is two negatives sandwiched together. We're talking glass plates at this point. So he took an exposure for the sky, he took an exposure for the water, and he printed them together. And at the time, it was called combination printing. Okay, smart guy. Oscar Rielander was another early photographer, and he said, okay, I'm going to take topics from literature and the Bible. I'm going to set up a scene. So this is completely set up with models and props. And he also stitched 37 negatives together to make a huge panorama. Okay? So his attitude was the difficulty it took me to make this, the topic, the subject matter, and my process all makes it be art. Okay? If you won't accept the straight photograph as art, let me see what I can do. We also had Henry Peach Robinson, who, as you can see, began to work with mixed media. So he was going to fill this in later, but this is an initial sketch of a photograph with pencil drawing. Okay? He also worked with combination printing. So he was famous for many scenes. Oh, I do have it here. This is a famous photograph by him. If you know anything about photographic lighting, this picture might make your head start to go, huh? Okay, especially this is the day before ProPhoto lighting, right? Or any sort of lighting at all when it came to photography. Look at how the light's falling on the women and this woman and backlit window. It's impossible in natural light. Okay, so he photographed each. He photographed this, then the man at the window, and stitched them together. Félix Nadar was a Frenchman who's also known to be one of the innovators of photography early on. Photographed a lot of famous people, but also did a lot of character studies and, again, sort of setting up of scenes. He was quite an eccentric, and he went down to the sewers of Paris and photographed, and he argued that subject matter was irrelevant. I can make beautiful photographs of the sewers of Paris. He also then went up into a balloon and took aerial photographs of Paris. And so, yeah, he was quite an innovator. This was the tagline for this: Nadar elevating photography to art in his hot air balloon. And then we had not many women at this point photographing, but it was mostly women of the wealthy European men who were able to get their hands on the equipment and be taught by their husbands. Okay, but look at the posing and the usage of light that's happening in these scenes. And then we had Lady Filmer, who, this is complete mixed media. She's using colored pencils, cut out photographs, okay, from 1864. So these were people early on who were saying, hey, this isn't just objective reality, okay? So then we have in 1888, good old George Eastman from the Kodak company comes out with a dry plate technology. So meaning you could just have the plates ready to go and put in your camera. You didn't have to coat them and do them in a tent, basically. And he also comes out with the first handheld camera in 1888. So enter into history the snapshot. There's George Eastman trying to sell one of his first handheld cameras on an ocean liner. Here's their ad. Can you imagine what this was making the art photographers do who were trying to elevate the status to art? It was killing them, okay? And we were talking over lunch, I was talking with David, or after the interview, that history repeats itself. What do you think the art photographers were doing, or the professional photographers were doing when digital came out? Besides embracing it, or when the iPhone came out, right? Same thing. So we have the snapshot. Here's the woman with her shadow in there. So this changed what subject matter began to be photographed. Okay, we saw pictures of picnics now and everyday activities, and we had never seen that before. So to set that stage, yes?
Just on that last photograph, were the pictures that came from that early Kodak snapshot camera round like that?
No, this was a matting around it. Yep. So the reason I had to set that stage is because all of that then sets the stage for the very first photographic movement called pictorialism. Okay? So it's a reaction to the point and shoot approach to photography. You hit the button, we do the rest. And that was true. They literally sent you the camera with the film in it. You shot, you sent the entire camera back to Kodak. They processed the film and then put the film right back in it and sent it back to you. Okay? They figured the harder this process is and the more my hands are in it, the more it's going to separate itself from point and shoot photography. So they relied on labor-intensive processes that showed the human hand. It emphasized the photographer as a craftsman, and they heavily worked their negatives. They also printed on textured papers. It was very painterly. And they scratched negatives, they retouched negatives, okay, glass plates perhaps. So at this point, you know, in a much longer lecture, I would go into a biography of each of these people. Okay, we don't have time for that, but I at least want to give you their names and visually show you what the movement looked like. Gertrude Casimir was one of the few women in the pictorialist movement. I will give you some facts that I have as we look at the pictures. She was an American, photographed a lot of Native Americans. She began studying photography at Pratt when she was 37 years old. And she was one of the founding members of the photo successionists, which we're going to talk about next. So any anomalies you see here could be just from the process, or it could be purposely scratching and pulling away the emulsion from the negative. And this is a portrait of Casimir. Heinrich Kuhn. His work is really lovely, many different subject matter, but take a look at the style. He's Austrian. He was one of the first people that we saw doing this unique perspective from above. Something that we get used to seeing all the time now, but was very rare for that time. And then he started to dabble in the first color process, which was called autochrome. It was actually invented by the Lumiere brothers. And it was the first color film, but it was not stable, so it faded. So that went away, and the Kodachrome came after the autochrome. Had a really limited color palette, but really beautiful. This is all autochrome. So notice how painterly these images look. Okay, so photographers at this point were going, I don't know, let's mimic painting. They accept painting as art, but not photography. Let's do that. And I'd like to bring in portraits of the people so we can just get an idea of what these characters look like. Clarence White was an American. He was completely self-taught, no formal education. Not that there were no schools in photography at this point. He became one of the first photography educators at Columbia University. And he also founded the very first photography school called the Clarence H. White School of Modern Photography. So I'm going to show you the last two pictorialists, the most important and well-known, probably some that you've heard of, Edward Steichen. This is probably his most famous photograph. Steichen was, I just wrote an article for my magazine. I said if there's 3 names, sort of unknown names that you might want to study in the history of photography, Steichen would be one of them. Paul Strand would be another that we're going to look at. Meaning he did so much. He started as a trained painter and drawer. He was the editor for Camera Work magazine, which we're going to talk about, the first photographic publication. He founded the photo succession movement with Stieglitz. He opened the first photographic gallery called Gallery 291 here in New York. He made the very first fashion photograph. He was the highest paid and first fashion photographer for many different magazines. He headed up military aerial photography in World War I. He was in charge of naval photography in World War II. He won an Academy Award for a documentary film, and he became the second head of the photography department at MoMA. The guy's a legend in photography, really. And he began as a pictorialist. The other person who's quite the legend is Alfred Stieglitz. We refer to him as the grandfather of art photography. He and Steichen were really good buddies and worked together. And I am going to look in some of these movements, we're going to look at what was happening in painting and compare the movements and how they were influencing each other. Because definitely what was happening in the art world was influencing photography, and what was happening in photography was influencing the rest of the art world. My favorite history book is A Cultural History of Photography, because what was happening in the world affected photography as it does now, and what was happening in photography affects our society and how we see the world. Stieglitz is considered the grandfather of art photography because he was, in America, he was the first to really stand up and say, to help form a collective of people and say, listen, our job is to make people believe that photography can be art. He and Steichen were both behind, he was a lover of Georgia O'Keeffe, so he has many, many, many photographs of Georgia O'Keeffe. He and Steichen were the ones behind the very first gallery, the very first publication, the very first American Camera Club. He was a huge advocate of pushing photography as an art medium, and he was the first person to show photography next to famous painters. Well, they weren't famous yet, but next to Impressionist paintings in his gallery. So he was showing photography next to people like Monet and Matisse eventually. And here is a picture of Stieglitz. So I want to talk just a little bit about Stieglitz and a project he did called Equivalence. Okay, it was basically a series of photographs that he did with his huge camera with huge bellows. Okay, and it was pictures of clouds. Now, why is this series important? Because it's probably one of the first photographic series that was based on the idea of metaphor or symbolism. Okay? So there was a famous interview with Stieglitz where the interviewer says to him, now everybody's going to turn off their phones, where the interviewer says to him, are these pictures of clouds? And he says, I don't see why that matters. And the interviewer says, okay, but are these clouds? And he says, it's irrelevant what they are. He says, what do they mean to you? What do they make you feel? What do they represent to you? Okay, so to him, the image was a metaphor for another idea, experience, or feeling, which is why he called it equivalence. Every photograph, he said, has an equivalent idea or emotion attached to it. That could be the idea or emotion that you had as the photographer. It can be the idea, emotion that the viewer brings to it. Okay? So he was constantly pushing the way people thought about photography and the capabilities of what photography could be. Okay, so we had the pictorialist movement was an international movement, okay, but then we have a group of Americans led by Alfred Stieglitz who forms a purely American movement called the photo successionists. And it was basically bounced off the Linked Ring. The Linked Ring was a British exclusive photographic club that you were invited to, and Stieglitz decided to make an American version of that, and that's what he called the photo successionists. Okay? So this was the theme for the Linked Ring. This is what Stieglitz said about the photo succession. To advance photography as applied to pictorial expression, because that's what they were doing at the time, to draw together those Americans practicing or otherwise interested in the art, and to hold from time to time in varying places exhibits, not necessarily limited to the productions of the photo succession or to American work. So in 1902, they have the first exhibit of American pictorial photographers. And this is how this group came about. So basically, Stieglitz forms this exhibit, and the club director, the National Arts Club director who was showing the show, says to him, well, what shall we call this exhibit? And Stieglitz says, let's call it an exhibit of American photography arranged by the photo succession. He made this up on the spot. And the guy says, well, what's that? Who is it? And he says, yours truly for the present, and there'll be others when the show opens. The idea of succession is hateful to Americans. They'll be thinking of the Civil War. I'm not. Photo succession actually means a succeeding from the accepted idea of what constitutes a photograph. Okay? So literally, he made up the idea of the photo successionist on the spot. And then the people that run the show, he said, hey, we're in this group now. It's called the photo successionists, all right? They said, okay, great. And Casabir was one of them. Clarence White was one of them. The ones I showed you were some of the founding members. Okay, in addition to a couple I'm going to show you right now. So they opened their first gallery called the Little Galleries of the Photo Succession right here in New York. Eventually became known as Gallery 291. One, because the Little Galleries of the Photo Succession was a really long name to remember. And two, because eventually the photo successionists decided not to do pictorialism anymore. So it became known as Gallery 291. Okay, two more members that were members of the photo successionists were Coburn. And we're going to take a look at him later when we talk about abstract photography. But here's some of his work right now. And this is his pictorialist work. Again, using that unique overhead perspective. Quite radical for that time. Here's a young portrait and a later portrait of Coburn. We also see Frank Eugene in the photo successionists. So here we have Steichen on the right, Heinrich Kuhn in the middle, then Stieglitz, then who did I say our last guy was? Oh, Frank Eugene.
They look like scientists.
They were scientists, some of them. Some of them were. We still are in a sense. So I want to ask you all, what visual characteristics are you seeing in this work? What are you relating to, or what do you see?
There's a lot of emotion in it.
A lot of emotion?
At least I feel that way.
Absolutely, there was. It was very expressive, right? Very expressive. Any other thoughts?
Soft, very soft.
Very soft, yeah, lots of, seemingly out of focus or soft, and a lot of that was due to the textured papers, okay?
Excellent composition of the image.
Yeah, there was some beautiful compositions. These are the very early photographers, so the only thing they had to go off of visually would have been looking at painting, okay? But yeah, I agree, and also some very nice, simple compositions.
Tones and his forms, light versus some.
Yeah, it was actually, we see a pretty limited tonal range in this work. Okay, and the reason, I'm identifying these characteristics is so that if you like pictorialism, you might want to write these things down if you want to try to mimic this look. Okay, they had a very limited tonal range because of the technology of the plates at that point. So we don't see a lot of really deep, rich blacks and bright whites, not a lot of high contrast.
It's like a dream almost.
It is very dreamy, I agree. Very dreamy, very ethereal. So how would we perhaps mimic this today? If you wanted to go out tomorrow and say, I want to make a pictorialist photograph, right? Well, let's take a look at some people who I think make pictorialist images who are working today. Jill Enfield, one of the photographers, she's based here in New York. She's featured in one of my magazines. So she still works with glass plate technology. She still works with old photographic processes. So notice the texture, that's the coating of the glass. So anything that's got a lot of texture, notice the limited color palette. The anomalies on the edge of the plates. And she loves when mistakes happen. If in the interview you'll read, she says, I love the unexpected. That's part of the reason she sticks to this technology. She said, yeah, I know digital. I know how to do that. I know Photoshop. But she said, so many photographers now strive to get out of the camera exactly what they imagine in their head, which is great when we can get there. That's successful, that's good. But she said, I like the unexpected element of every time I coat the plate, it's different. Okay, I never know what's gonna happen exactly. Okay, this is a wedding studio now, but look at the post-processing treatment they're doing in Photoshop that makes it look more pictorialist. Friend of mine who also lives here in the city. But look at this again, think of those qualities we talked about, this sort of soft, ethereal, dreamy. Okay, and he's done this processing in Lightroom or Photoshop to give it this limited color palette as well. Not to mention like the woman in nature that we saw in some of the other images that I had to flip through quickly because they were all nude. So adding layers of texture, and we can do that by printing on textured papers. We can do that by scanning textures in and putting them in as layers in Photoshop, okay, or using filters in Photoshop. The Park Harrisons, great photographers who I would think would definitely be influenced by the pictorialists. Also this setting up of scenes. So I'll try in each of these to throw in a few of my own images, just because I've tried to mimic each of these. I mean, I wasn't always conscious of mimicking them, okay? But this is an image that I did. Notice it's soft. And then what I did is I printed it out on a piece of paper. I scratched the paper and then scanned that print so that you could see physical scratches on the image. Yes?
Shoot it soft, or did you do that?
I shot it soft. Yep.
Filter just out of focus?
Slightly out of focus. Yeah, it's a self-portrait, and I was in my bathroom because there was great light in there. And so slightly out of focus. Yep. Okay, also just the post-processing treatment of it can make it look like it's from another time.
The previous picture that we took, where did you hold the camera?
I was on a tripod, so the question is, where did I hold the camera? It was on a tripod, and I was probably 2 to 3 feet from the camera.
No mirror.
Hmm?
There was no mirror. You didn't.
No mirror, no. Yeah, when I do self-portraits, I'll put something where I'm going to stand and focus on that, and then get in that place, and then of course check my focus and keep going back and forth. In that situation, I wasn't worried about the focus, so I was glad that it was slightly out. This is film that I shot from a plastic camera. Yes?
Well, I'm just curious because the picture that you showed that was slightly out of focus, I shoot out of focus quite a lot.
Uh-huh.
Quite a lot out of focus.
On purpose?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Just checking.
And, you said that you were surprised. Was this a surprise thing for you? Did you sort of discover it?
This one?
Yeah, because you didn't quite get your setup correctly, or were you intending to do it? That's really my question.
Oh, okay, yeah, let's talk about that. So when I first wanted to take the picture, I wanted it to be sharp. I thought in my head, and we talked about this a lot in my first class this morning, Fostering Creativity, how you go out with a plan, but sometimes you gotta let it go where it goes. So my plan was to be in focus, and I put up on the tripod, and I got in front, and I took the shot, and then I went to the back, and I looked at it, and it was soft, and I went, oh, I like that. That's beautiful. I'm gonna go with that. And then from then on, I worked with it being soft. Yeah.
I love it.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so at this moment in time, we realized that the photograph could document reality, or it could be an artistic form of self-expression. It's the two paths that photography can take, even today. Think of the way we use photography for scientific documentation or exploration versus artistic self-expression. So let's just glance at a couple other art movements that were happening in painting at this time, okay, just to give you an idea. So right before and right during the time that photography was invented, remember it was 1839, neoclassicism is one of the movements we see in painting. And here's some examples of neoclassicism. So again, these were the movements that were around before and right after photography was invented. So this is why Oscar Friedlander would use subject matter similar to this, thinking that he could then call it art. Romanticism, another movement at this time. Also about strong emotion and paying attention to new emotions that we had not seen depicted in art before. Also the power of imagination. Very dramatic. And then we see realism, okay? Not a coincidence that realism in painting came about immediately after the invention of photography, okay? So revolted against the exaggerated emotionalism of Romanticism, emphasis on the present, the real, and existing, and objective reality. Exactly what the camera was doing, okay? Also depicting, peasants and rural scenes, which was not something that was considered to be art subject matter before. Absolutely visually influenced by photography.
Did the painters feel threatened by the photo?
Yeah, yes, they did. I mean, I can't speak for every painter in that era, but yes, I do believe that painting was a little bit, because think about it, prior to then, painting had been the way you would get your portrait made. And only people who could afford to have a painter commissioned to paint their portrait were able to do that. So once photography came about, we saw the middle classes eventually, not in the beginning, being able to get portraits. And it was a much easier way to get a portrait, a likeness of yourself made, not to mention cheaper. So they kind of took the portraiture thing away from painters. And a lot of painters who were trained in painting decided to move over to photography. Most of the painters that weren't, I can't say this across the board, but a lot of painters that didn't feel as skilled in painting moved over to photography. So here's a quote by Dumacher. "We must realize that on undertaking pictorial photography, we have unwittingly perhaps bound ourselves to the strict observance of rules hundreds of years more ancient than the oldest formula of our chemical craft. We have slipped into the temple of art by a back door and found ourselves amongst the crowd of adepts." And I believe this to be true. Photographers had no history to pull on. They literally invented the medium, and then they were going, okay. And all they had to look at was painting, and here they are trying to say, we can be art, but we're 3 years old. And so here they were in the temple of arts, trying to convince people that photography, as he said, slipped through the back door, could be art. And it took, I will argue, until about 1960, until truly photography was accepted generally as an art form.
Weren't a lot of artists were accused of using photographs to make their paintings as if that was bad?
Yes, a painter, the comment was a lot of artists used photographs to paint from, so they would make the photograph and then make the painting from the photograph, and they would never admit that they did that. That was highly looked down upon. But when you look at some of the paintings from that era now, you can see that because of the perspectives, we were seeing new perspectives and methods in paintings that we had not seen before the development of the camera. So that's why we think that many of them were actually painting from photographs, which they wouldn't want to admit. And we're going to talk about today, we're in the era, we don't really know what era we're in when it comes to photography, but today anything goes, truly. I don't mean anything can be art, but I mean any method, whatever your method to get to the final piece, I don't think we look down upon those methods as much anymore as we used to. So I'm just going to keep coming back to this timeline so we see where we are. So we were right here, okay? And now we're going to move to straight photography, which is going to cover the entire timeline. Okay, so let's take a look at a timeline of straight photography. So we have pictorialism in the very beginning. We have in the very last issue of Camera Work, so Camera Work was the first photo publication made by Steichen and Stieglitz, dedicated to photographic art, and he had shown pictorialists and photo successionists through the entire thing. In the very last issue, Stieglitz features Paul Strand and his straight photography. And that was Stieglitz's way of saying, forget this pictorialism stuff, we're moving in a new direction. At the time in America, Stieglitz was really the visionary. He was like maybe one of the big art critics today, although there's so many, but he was the one who was the, finger on the pulse of what's happening. And then we see another straight photographer, Laszlo Mihaly Nagy, who starts to work in straight photography. And then we're going to look at Kertész and some of the great Parisian photographers like Cartier-Bresson and Brassai, who roamed the streets of Paris. And then California modernists, we'll talk about a little bit later, but the FSA photographers, Robert Frank, and the great American street photographers were all straight photographers. So let's take a look at some of these people. First, what is straight photography? Okay, it was first used in opposition to the combination printing and the pictorialist manipulations. So the gentleman in the back who said pictorialism isn't photography, he'd be aligning himself with this crew, if you lived in those days. Okay. 1917, Strand refers to the absolute unqualified objectivity of the photograph. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy calls his work is referred to as pure photography. And eventually the California modernists, who are Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Imogen Cunningham, adopt that term pure photography to describe their work. This aesthetic also influenced the great documentary photographers of the FSA, Walker Evans, Margaret Burke White, and the great American street photographers as well that we're going to look at. We're not going to go into the FSA photographers because technically they were documentary photographers and we're more studying art movements. So there's a lot of people I'm leaving out because I'm focusing on the art movements. Not that their work wasn't art, it was, but it wasn't their intention. So what we see in straight photography, we see high contrast images, we see sharp focus, generally no cropping. It was thought that that would be cheating. And we see a very strong underlying geometric structure or emphasis on the formal aspects of the photograph.
How do they take photos that are high contrast? How?
Well, in the beginning, the question is how do they take photos that were high contrast? In the beginning, Strand's work wasn't very high contrast. But when we get later on with the better films, they will be high contrast. But one of the things that Strand emphasized is he started printing on papers that were not textured like the pictorialists, and that allowed to show a greater tonal range. So he chose different papers to make them look more photographic and less painterly. So I talked about Camera Work magazine. Here's the cover that's Edward Steichen designed. So what happens is the photo successionists who were pictorialists, all of a sudden a few of them start going, you know what, we're doing photography a disservice by trying to make it look like painting. The camera was invented to exactly depict reality. So Stieglitz, Steichen, a few other photographers break away from the photo successionists. And like I said, Stieglitz features Paul Strand as an example of where he thinks photography should go. So let's take a look at some of Paul Strand's straight photography. I love quotes, so I'm going to include quotes from some of the people that we're exploring. Paul Strand, by the way, studied under Louis Hine, the great documentary photographer. So take a look at how different these look from some of the pictorialist images that we saw. Probably one of his most famous photographs. Precursor to the great American street photographers. I tried to put dates on most of them. If I don't have a date, I couldn't find the date. Paul Strand also spent a fair amount of time in Mexico photographing there.
These are all Strand?
These are all Strand, yep. He went on a trip to Gallery 291 and was influenced by the work he saw there, and that's what made him pick up photography. It's a very small circle in those days, unlike today. He was also an accomplished filmmaker. So pay attention again to the emphasis on form. So when I talk about the formal aspects of photography, that would be line, shape, texture, those geometric structures underneath it. And there's a photograph of Paul Strand. So another one that was a huge influence on straight photography was Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And people referred to his photography as pure photography. He was a Hungarian. He was not a trained photographer. He was trained as a painter and a sculptor and an illustrator. And he was known for his early photographs. Look at his really unique perspectives. Okay, really interesting perspectives. And he was also a master of using light and shadow in his photographs. He was actually, this is a shot of the Eiffel Tower, like one no one had seen before. Okay, so he developed what he termed it the new vision. And what he referred to as the new vision was, he said, we can do with the camera what our human eyes can't imagine. We just have to get creative and show people what the camera can do. It can show them perspectives like this that they had never thought of before. He also was really instrumental in photography education. He was asked to teach at the Art Foundation School at the Bauhaus in Berlin. And he was the one who said, if we're going to teach foundation art, we're going to include photography. And after the Bauhaus was closed down by the Nazi Party, he came to Chicago and formed what we referred to as the new Bauhaus, which was the Chicago Institute of Design. So again, check out the very unique perspectives. It's hard for us to imagine. We're so inundated with images now, we get used to seeing so many interesting angles. And these are portraits of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. We're going to look at him again in abstract photography. He was quite an innovator in that as well. And I love this quote by him because this is so early on. He's saying the illiterate of the future will be the person ignorant of the use of the camera as well as the pen, at least in developed places. Pretty smart guy, pretty early on. I mean, now you can imagine life without cameras. I mean, they're everywhere. Yes?
Like, the thing that I'm not quite following is, like the artist discovered, like Vermeer discovered perspective, okay, and he developed perspective. But the thing is, the photographers could look at Vermeer and they could see what he did, how he shaped the floor, you know, where he put the woman standing next to the window and stuff. So, were they rediscovering this stuff, or they thought they were creating it anew?
No, I mean, a lot, especially because first, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was trained as a painter and sculptor. So a lot of these people had backgrounds in art. So they were well aware of what painters were doing. But, they're taking a machine. I mean, think about it. The first thing that I teach students in visual studies is to learn how the camera sees. The camera sees differently than the human eye. Right? I'm sure a lot of you experience that, where you see a scene, you take the camera, you take the shot, and you go, that's not what I saw. Wait a minute. So we have to understand how each lens sees, how the camera sees. Okay, the camera sees differently than the human eye. So it was taking this new device, figuring out how it saw, and then trying to show these interesting perspectives. And instead of sitting in this, no, I'm not knocking painters here, I think painters are amazing, but instead of sitting in this studio and imagining, which is amazing, and painting it on a canvas, he had to crawl up the Eiffel Tower with the camera and make that perspective. Okay, so it's having to actually physically go into that space and make it happen with the camera. Yes?
The persons who he referred to in this statement, do you think he meant it equally well to the creator of the content as well as the consumer of the content created by a camera?
I do. Yeah, the question is, do you think he was speaking of the creator and the consumer or viewer? And I think he was. I think he was. And he really realized early on how relevant photography was going to be to our culture. I mean, could he foresee where we are now, where every single person on the street of New York probably has a camera on them, at least in their phone? Maybe not, I don't know. But he understood how important this medium was and how important it was to at least accept it. And he didn't think everybody was going to be a photographer, certainly. Yeah. So the American street photographers were influenced by other photographers who came before them. So now we're going to move to the next huge, so who I just showed you, Strand and Moholy-Nagy, were the precursors to street photography. I mean, Strand was doing it in 1917. Moholy-Nagy was doing it also in the early, 19 teens and 20s. Okay, but now let's jump to the big photography movement of street photographers, which were the American street photographers. Okay, but first I want to focus on a few European photographers who influenced them. Okay, not many people, everybody knows the name, Cartier-Bresson, but not many people know André Kertész. And André Kertész influenced Bresson. He was a Hungarian, moves to Paris in 1925, has his first one-man exhibition in Paris in 1927. He's published in magazines all over Europe, and his work is widely exhibited. I mean, this could be a Cartier-Bresson if you know his work. It's very, very similar. That decisive moment. He immigrates to the US in 1936 and establishes himself in the New York City commercial photography scene. And in 1964, John Sarkowski, who's the director of the photography department at MoMA, features a solo show of his work in 1964. Here he is. There. No, here? Yeah, there we go. Kertész influences the famous Paris street photographers like Cartier-Bresson and Bresson. So Bresson is known for photographing the streets of Paris, often at night. I think of Bresson as the night street Paris photographer, and Cartier-Bresson is the day street Paris photographer, generally. Bresson was a master of light and shadow. I mean, look at his images and how he uses light and shadow to create forms in his image.
Did he use a tripod?
You know, he did. In fact, I didn't think he did because I thought, nah, he didn't use a tripod. I don't even know if there were tripods yet. And then I found a portrait of him, and he's on a tripod. So you'll see there's a picture of him there. Bresson was also known for shooting inside clubs and restaurants during nighttime in Paris, so the night life in Paris. Also photographing the fringes of society. This woman might look like a high society woman, but look at her dirty, gritty fingers and fingernails. Okay, so he also photographed the fringes of society living in Paris. It's Picasso. There he is, so that's how I knew he had a tripod. Purpose of art is to raise people to a higher level of awareness than they would otherwise attain on their own. It's a pretty lofty plan there, but we hope it can do that. And then we have Cartier-Bresson, who coined the term the decisive moment. And he was the master of the decisive moment, right? Knowing when to wait and hit that shutter when something happened. Okay, we didn't have rapid fire, you know, how many frames per second. Fire away and pick the shot later. And these two, Bresson and Kertész, hugely influenced the great American street photographers. Notice the placement of his subjects, that anticipation of the moment and being ready to hit the shutter. There he is. To take a photograph is to align the head, the eye, and the heart. It's a way of life. Another person that influenced the great American street photographers that I cannot ignore or not discuss here would be Walker Evans, who was an FSA photographer, Farm Security Administration. Okay. An organization during the FDR administration. Their original purpose was to go out into the rural areas of America and focus on the success and the work of basically how the funding was helping the people in America, okay? And what happened is photographers brought back very startling and depressing images of this time. In fact, Walker Evans, here's his most famous photograph of Allie Mae Burroughs. Walker Evans was the first hire and the first fire of the FSA photographers because he brought his images back and they said, no, that won't do. You're supposed to bring back images showing the good works that our money is helping to fund. And he said, I'm going to bring back what I'm seeing. And they said, get out of here. He goes on assignment in 1926 to photograph white tenant families. After he gets fired from the FSA, he has many projects in Hale County, Alabama, and this becomes his famous book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Really the first book of its kind, a documentary project with photographs and stories. He becomes a writer at Time magazine, an editor for Fortune magazine. He's known for using a lot of signage in his photographs. A lot of text. Polaroid, when they were trying to push Polaroid film, approached Evans and said, will you shoot color? In fact, many of the color companies came to Ansel Adams, Walker Evans, Edward Weston and said, could you please shoot color so we could convince everyone else to shoot color? And they said, no way. I'm not touching it with a 10-foot pole, because they didn't consider color to be artistic, and they associate it with commercial photography and amateur snapshot photography. Okay, but finally, like a decade later, a few of them gave in. Well, they all gave in at some point and decided to shoot. And Evans shot Polaroids, and I love how, look at all the signage still in his images. And here he is. So let's take a look at the great American street photographers. It's hard for me to narrow this down. Yes?
Didn't Evans shoot a large format camera, and would not be sort of easy to be catching a candid shot? A lot of his shots were posed.
I think he started with a large format camera when he was for the FSA. David, back me up if you know anything about.
They loaned him a Deerdorf.
Okay.
He didn't want to give it back. Shot with a Rolly and a Deerdorf.
Okay, yeah.
It's been nice.
So yeah, difficult to just grab those, quick candids for sure. And a lot of the photographers from the FSA were accused, as Margaret Burke White was, of posing their people slightly, which was looked down upon and still really is a little bit in documentary photography. Photojournalism, absolutely not accepted. But yeah, I mean, I feel like if they were moving an arm slightly to improve the composition so that it would draw a viewer in a little more, I'm personally okay with that. If it makes people look and pay attention to the topics that they're talking about, in that case. So one of the foremost great American street photographers who probably influenced everyone after him was Robert Frank. And he did a project called The Americans. He traveled around America to cities and towns around America and photographed American life. He could not get this book published in the States because American publishers found it extremely depressing. It was first published in France. Because Frank, and he wasn't, I guess he could have focused on this aspect of American society, but as he started moving around the country, he started realizing that we were a society who was isolated. Okay, that a lot of people were not making eye contact with each other. A lot of people were, off in their own worlds. A lot of homes were centered around the television set. Okay, he was originally born in Switzerland, but came here early on. He was pretty jaded by the fast pace of American life and what he considered to be a materialistic society. And it was in the 50s, so it was in 55 that he secured a Guggenheim with the help of Walker Evans to do the project called The Americans. There is Robert Frank by Richard Avedon. So the Americans would influence an entire movement of American street photographers who roamed the streets of our cities and towns, recording the lives and the society they witnessed. And this was really, I don't want to say it's the beginning of American photography, because we had the photo successionists, but this is truly the first really great, impactful American art or American photography movement. So we're going to take a look at some of these. There were so many, but I'm going to try to focus on the big ones. And I'll try to talk a little bit about what set their work apart from the others. Lee Friedlander was known for often including himself in the photograph, whether it was a reflection or a shadow. He was often a part of the photograph somehow. He was also awarded a Guggenheim in 1960. There he is, also by Richard Avedon. So this morning I talked a lot about thinking about what you're doing with your photographs. I believe there's two ways to work. There's having an idea and then executing it, or just making photographs and letting them inform you later. Okay, and he says right here, I'm not a premeditated photographer. I see a picture and I make it. Harry Callahan, one of the great street photographers, used to do a lot of double exposures. Callahan really wanted to focus on the chaos of city life, and so he often did double exposures. I don't know. I don't know if he's doing them in camera or in darkroom. Looks like in camera to me. He also focuses on a lot of structures, a lot of geometric forms in the buildings. He also makes really wonderful landscape photographs. Here's Carrie Callahan as a young man and an older gentleman. The mystery isn't in the technique, it's in each of us. Helen Levitt, one of the few well-known female street photographers. Helen Levitt didn't focus on the dark side of things like people like Frank. Her images are really whimsical. Lots of children at play, lots of irony to her images. I mean, notice the girl with the milk jugs and then the pregnant girl behind her. Okay, so lots of really fun, whimsical humor to her work. You could look at a Helen Levitt image and probably many things will come to you over time if you really explore them. But known for photographing children at play in some of the poorer neighborhoods in New York City. That would be endless subject matter. Kids, being kids. And then she's one of the few street photographers who moved into color and accepted color and started photographing. Part of it was because there was a break-in her apartment and most of her negatives were stolen. So she went, guess I'm starting over. So she got a Guggenheim to actually re-photograph the streets of New York in color. And here she is. I love her quote. She says, "Since I'm inarticulate, I express myself with images." She was apparently painfully shy, a real introvert, which is maybe why she photographed children. Yes?
The black and white and then to see it in color, it makes you feel like you're in a different place and time almost.
And it was a different place and time. Yeah, it feels very 70s, especially because of the way the film looked. Yeah, she was probably, I'm assuming she was shooting Kodachrome at that point.
But it looks like we're almost like two different people
Yeah, yeah,
in a sense.
yeah. It does look very different. Roy de Carava. He focused on black society at this time, photographed in Harlem. He was known for his really dark treatment of his prints. He printed all himself. Some of these people did not. And he printed, often printed a really limited tonal range and very dark. In 1955, he opens his own gallery to promote photography as fine art. In 2006, he was awarded the National Medal of Arts from the NEA. He was also the first African American to win the Guggenheim in 1952.
Why did he print very dark?
I don't know. I'm not sure why he preferred that visual look. The question was, why did he print very dark? I think it was just his visual choice. And this is him. It doesn't have to be pretty to be true, but if it's true, it's beautiful. Truth is beautiful. And so my whole work is about what amounts to a reverence for life itself. Another one of the female photographers of the great street photographers. Lisette Modell tend to focus on the, what people would consider not the beautiful people. A lot of women. Who don't look like they wanted to be photographed. She originally studied music and then gave up music for photography and painting. She taught Diane Arbus, who you can see if you know Diane Arbus's work. She also became one of the great photography educators of that decade, of that era, I should say. I picked it up without any kind of ambition to be good or bad, and especially without any ambition to make a living. My whole freedom working in photography comes because I say to myself, let's see what is going on in this world. Let's find out. How do these people look? Gary Winogrand was known for his really dark images of people on the streets of New York. There's always some sort of morbid element to his work, even her laughing with the headless man behind her. Okay, so this really dark look at who we are in society. Not all of his images, but a lot of his street photographs. And he had some whimsical shots. He did a whole series of images of people in zoos interacting with animals.
Just as a point of interest, the photograph on the right.
He was known, like the amount of film he left behind was staggering.
Has anybody done?
And this is him. Here I have it here. In 1984, at his death, he left over 2,500 rolls of film to be developed. And this is one of his famous quotes, I photographed to find out what something will look like photographed. And last but not least, Elliot Erwitt, not really considered to be one of the great street photographers, just because he didn't really travel in that crew traveling the streets of New York, but he focused a lot on animals and dogs and people, dogs and their owners, and really fun. He is an excellent photographer. We forget about humor in photography sometimes. He also just did photograph people exclusively, but also, with a sense of humor and quirkiness. This one's great. All the men and then the woman to the side. And this guy looks like a streaker or something with his trench coat. Still alive and working today. I hang this one in my studio. Oh, I forgot. Here's our last guy, Ralph Eugene Meatyard. He's an eye doctor. He practices as an eye doctor his entire life. He lives in, I think, Kentucky or Louisiana. So he's not New York artist. He has a family, he has children, he has a medical practice, and he does photography on the side. And he's known for giving masks to children and photographing children in their masks. Well, in masks he gives them. Completely self-taught in photography. But in his lifetime, he photographed with greats such as Minor White, Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Aaron Siskin, Harry Callahan, and Robert Frank. He was from Lexington, Kentucky. So we talked about this morning is just going with any strange idea you might have and following that thread. That's what Meatyard did with his masks and his photographs of children. Many of them were his own children or neighbors. And then he started experimenting with movement in front of the camera. So, what are the visual characteristics of what we saw? Great straight photography. Maybe depicting the world around us as it is, looking for shots around us. How would we mimic this today? Well, documentary photography comes from straight photography. Also, that deadpan approach to photography, objective reality, sharp, clearly influenced by Elliot Irwin, I would say. This is a wedding photographer. Mary Ellen Mark, a great documentary photographer. Very similar to the FSA photographers, I think. This is a homeless family who is living in their car. So no shallow depth of field, no skewing the image, but documenting life of Americans around the country or elsewhere. Of course, we see it being done in color now. And I don't have very many straight photographs that I feel fit in this realm, but I chose a few. How about, let's call it documenting the world as you see it. All right, next movement, 3 in 1. These were not photography movements. These were movements in the art world, but they heavily relied on the camera. So now we're here. So this is a movement, a lot of it was in reaction to World War I. Heavily influenced by Cubism. But we're going to take a look at Dada, Surrealism, and the Russian constructivists. So between the two world wars, and the other art movements that were happening at the time that influenced these, heavily influenced by Cubism. So Cubism was about showing multiple viewpoints at one time and was heavily influenced by three-dimensional representation of Cezanne. And here are some examples of Cubism. And I think you'll see when we start to look at these movements how painting was influencing these movements. Well, a lot of them were painting movements. Expressionism is another movement happening in painting. Expressed intense emotion and distorted reality, as did Cubism. Okay, we're moving towards abstraction in painting. They were heavily influenced by Edvard Munch. So again, painting's moving more abstraction. I'm guessing to move itself further away from photography, perhaps.
This has come up before. One other way of looking is photography freed these people.
Perhaps, absolutely. I think that's a great way of looking at it. He said photography freed these people to see in different ways. And then we saw different movements, the German movement, the French movement, the Italian movement, Futurism. Focused a lot on current technology and industrialization, loathing everything old, including art. So we see a lot of rapid movement, reference to text and type, the pace of life. Okay, so let's look at our first movement here, Dada. It's a non-art, non-movement, nonsensical. They called it Dada because it was a word that sounded the same in every language, and it was a word that didn't make sense. It had no meaning. It was in response to the horrors of World War I, began at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, and it was an intentionally international movement at a time of extreme nationalism. We had lost confidence in our culture. This is one of the founding members of the Dada movement. Most of these artists were very young and had opted out of the war. Word was spread by publications, manifestos, rather than organized exhibits. And they used all forms of expression. That was cabaret performances, meetings, art, writing, and even riots. So they were real avant-garde. They were real renegade. The movement then moved to Berlin and was more anti-establishment, and then it moved to New York, where it was less political. Why is this important to photography? Because it's not a photography movement. Because the Dadaists heavily used the camera. This is the beginnings of photo collage. Okay, and here's some definitions of these terms in case you don't know them. Okay, so using photo collage and photo montage, they also used what they called ready-mades, which is taking regular things and turning them into sculpture, and assemblage, which is a three-dimensional collage. So let's take a look. So these are artists using the camera and photography in their work. They are not trained photographers. They have no allegiance to the medium of photography. They don't care if photography is art or not. They could care less. But they recognize that the camera is a symbol of progress and industrialization. Here's Marcel Duchamp with a ready-made. So that's a ready-made sculpture. Marcel Duchamp was really one of the most outspoken members of the Dadaists. And he was a real, he liked to stir up controversy. For instance, he took a reproduction of the Mona Lisa and painted a mustache and beard on it, and then put a lewd comment underneath it. Okay, Marcel Duchamp was always asking people to question what is art. He submitted a urinal to one of the salons of Paris as a sculpture, signed by R. Mutt. Okay, this is at a time where he's trying to break down the barriers of high art. You know, only a select few saying this is art. We only get to say who artists are. And he said, forget you guys. I say what art is, if I want to. Okay, so here's another Dadaist, and look at, they're using they're using images from print and publication, magazines, newspapers, and photographs that are cut out and glued together. You can see, I would think that this is going to influence surrealism as well. Hartfield is one who made a lot of collages speaking out against the Nazi Party. So he came later, or did work later. He was a part of the original Dadaists. So again, heavily using photographs, but not necessarily as photographers. This is what an exhibit would look like. Things hanging from the ceiling, okay, not, perfectly lined up on the wall. So then comes surrealism shortly after. Surrealism is very much attached to dream studies of Freud and political ideas of Marx. Okay, it's very much about the subconscious. I'm going to flip through these because I don't want to waste our time on a lot of text. I want you to see the images. But it's basically definitions, technically, of surrealism. It's based on the belief, the omnipotence of dreams, the undirected play of thoughts. Okay, and they were also using camera technology or camera processes. So solarization is when you put white light on an image when it's in the darkroom in Developer, and it starts to begin to look like a negative. They used distortion with lenses and mirrors. They played with the photogram, which is a cameraless image, and assemblage. So a photogram is when you have photographic paper in the darkroom and you put objects on it and you expose it to light. So there's no negative. Man Ray, he called it the rayograph, conceitedly. He said he invented the photogram. So surrealism, it had a range. Some of it was like a little bit realistic, but others was pure fantasy. This is solarization. Also solarization. Of course, one of the most famous surrealists was Dali, who also worked with photography, not just painting. So some of the surrealists we might be familiar with. Rene Magritte also used the camera, as you can see. And I'll show you more of his photographs and paintings. And just some examples of the paintings of surrealists. These artists were not concerned with the viewer understanding their work. That was not a motive to communicate something specifically. Did they have some meaning to them? Yes, usually from dream states or the subconscious, okay? But they were not concerned with the viewer getting it. Were they trying to convey anything? Yeah, I think they were trying to get people to think about what's beyond this dimension we live in and tapping into these other worlds or places that they believed in. And then Russian constructivism, influenced by Cubism. It was art for social purposes that emerged in the Russian Revolution of 1917. They wanted the viewer to be an active viewer. A quote from them is, "The streets are brushes, the squares are palettes." Heavily tied into graphic design. They also used photo montage. They heavily focused on materials and construction. And they were known for using really unique angles, as we saw with Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. So Alexander Rodchenko, he worked in sculpture, so that's him in the background. But we again see a heavy use of this photo collage. But this is all for political statements. But he would make the photograph to bring into his political poster. Very Monty Python-esque, some of it. And Rodchenko made really amazing photographs with really unique perspectives. Take a look at these photographs. Really interesting compositions. He was a designer by training, which I think is interesting considering his compositions. Take from different points of view and in different situations, rather than looking through the same keyhole again and again. Here's some other Russian constructivists using photographs. So there's the photograph and then incorporated into the collage. L. Lisitsky was another one of the great Russian constructivists. And he worked heavily in graphic design as well, and sculpture. So what were the visual characteristics of the movements we've seen? Dada, Surrealism, Russian constructivist.
Shapes.
Lots of geometric shapes. Lots of fragmentation, definitely. Lots of layers.
And it's completely off of realism.
Excuse me?
It's completely off of realism.
Yes. Completely, absolutely. Completely different from realism and what we're used to seeing. So here's some current artists who I think are heavily influenced by some of these movements. We even have the pipe, Magritte's pipe. Adam Foose works solely in photograms, cameraless images. Maggie Taylor, an artist, right, who works in surrealism, scanning images. Jerry Yulesman, her husband, surrealist images. New York-based photographer Gary Schneider, unknown. Okay, so modern day photographers being influenced by these movements. Photo collage, David Hockney. Barbara Kruger, look at the influence of the constructivist in this one. Text, political statement, photograph. So here's some of my work, not necessarily consciously thinking about these movements, but certainly later realizing that I'm influenced by them. The use of text and geometric shapes and layers. Is it really 5:30? Got a lot of history to go through in a half hour. A lot of history.
Talk faster.
2 hours went fast. Okay, so to sum up this, these avant-garde international movements had a lasting impact on the art that we see today. They heavily relied on the camera for visual experimentation and to refer to mass media. Okay, clippings from magazines, newspapers. Most of them were not formally trained as photography, did not care about the history of photography, and had no allegiance to the medium itself. They did, however, alter the ideas of perspective and composition with the camera and hugely influenced experimentation within the medium. California modernists, probably my shortest group because they're a small group. Okay, so 1931, heavily influenced by Mahaly, and pure photography. And here they are, right there, Group F64. So the lineage of California modernism is a movement we call precisionism. Okay, but we talked about the new vision, which is a term Laszlo Mahaly coined, okay, about unqualified objectivity. Heavily influenced by some of the great straight photographers I showed you. I'm not going to dwell on modernism here. I want to move on to the images. So the precisionists were a movement they weren't necessarily a movement, they were just a style, but a highly controlled approach to the medium. Simple compositions with lots of strong geometric forms, influenced by photographers like Strand, used sharp focus, was distinctly American, and the subjects were American landscape and regional culture. So they were the precisionists. Here's Charles Sheeler, which is one of the precisionists. A lot of focus on industrial landscapes, buildings, architecture. They also made films. There's Paul Strand, who never goes away. He moves through so many movements. And then we see the precisionists of the West Coast, which is Group F64, a group you've probably all heard of. Ansel Adams, Imogen Cunningham, Edward Weston. Okay, and their object is to present in frequent shows what it considers to be the best contemporary photography of the West. Okay, they wanted to differentiate themselves from the New York art scene. That was their way of saying there's something going on elsewhere. Let's pay attention. Also, because of the natural landscape and the exploration of the West, they wanted to focus on that. Again, we're not going to dwell on all of that, but they were definitely heavily influenced by Paul Strand and straight photography. Here's a quote by Edward Weston. When he says these cheap abortions have nothing to do with art nor life, he's talking about a lot of the stuff you just saw. He said, forget that junk. I want to use the camera for what it's good for, and I want to focus on the reality around me. They make a gallery called 683, which is the West Coast equivalent of Gallery 291, and they have their first exhibit at the De Young Museum. They're about straight photography, sharp images, maximum depth of field, carefully composed. Many of them use large format cameras on tripods, photographing the natural environment around them. They were all about beauty. They contact printed on glassy paper for the sharpest image they could get. Okay, here's some of the unknown members of the original F-64. This is a film he made about New York. Another unknown member that we probably haven't heard of. John Paul Edwards also. Okay, now we're getting to the big names. Imogen Cunningham, the only female member besides Sonia, actually, Sonia was a female member, of the F-64 group. This is a little more of her pictorialist work. She started in pictorialism and then moved to the modernist approach. So this is all Imogen Cunningham. She also was hired to photograph a lot of botanical specimens at her university when she was going to school. That's how she paid her way through college. So that's why she focused so much on flowers later. She was often compared to Georgia O'Keeffe. I think being reasonably poor is very good for people, she says. Edward Weston, one of the great modernists, was very versatile. He worked with portraits. This was his lover, Tino Modati. He worked in still life, what he was very well known for, with his Pepper series and his shell photographs. Weston is said to, has been known to say that he will photograph any subject matter, including toilets. He said he could photograph anything. He could find beauty in anything. He also dabbled in color later on. And I think he was a pretty excellent color photographer. Ansel Adams, not so much. Seen his color, it just doesn't even compare to his black and white. Partially because he probably didn't master the color printing technique, would be my guess. He was a master darkroom printer. But Weston, he did pretty well with color, having photographed in black and white his entire life. And he also photographed beautiful landscapes. He was a really diverse, talented photographer. Portraits, still lifes, landscapes. He did a lot of nudes that I won't be showing here. Master of light and shadow. He didn't not photograph at high noon when the light was contrasty. He photographed in any light. There he is. And last but not least, photographer we all know and love. I'll try to show you maybe some of his lesser known Adams images. His famous Yosemite shots. He was a custodian in Yosemite. Worked as a custodian just so he could be there to photograph. He went and photographed in the Japanese internment camps. after World War II. And there he is as a young man and photographing in Yosemite. I would agree with this these days. The force of originality in creation profoundly affecting the roots of human spirit. So, the visual characteristics of modernism: strong geometric form, high contrast, broad tonal range, sharp images. So, lots of black and white landscape, and it was black and white. Okay, it was truly black and white. There was no color in modernist photographs. So, an emphasis on form and broad tonal ranges. And often photographing the natural landscape. If you want to be a modernist, I would recommend trying all of that. Here's some example of my modernists. Can't do the sharp focus for me. It's more shallow. Elizabeth Stone. So I would say if you want to be a modernist, try black and white landscape. Depicting reality, sharp. High contrast. So it was probably one of the first organized movements outside of New York City. They tried to elevate photography to art using its technical and aesthetic qualities. They did not stay together long, just several years. And it consisted, of course, some of the most well-known and loved photographers today that we know of. Okay, y'all, I got 10 minutes to get through the last two. We're never gonna get through the last one, the entire last one, because postmodernism could be a year-long class, okay? But I'll touch upon where we are today. So we're moving here. Abstract photography, even though Paul Strand dabbled in it in the beginning, he's known to be probably one of the first abstract photographers, it heavily came about and was influenced by these avant-garde movements I showed you, Surrealism, Dada, and Russian Constructivism. But it was also most strongly a reaction to World War II. Okay, so there was post-World War II, there was the fear of communism, there was the Cold War, and a lot of photographers and artists started turning inward and saying, I don't want to photograph the world around me, I'm gonna start focusing on other things. So abstract art has a strong emphasis on form. So for photography, that would be shapes, textures, colors, line, where the subject matter is often hidden. We don't always know what it is. Things are abstracted, exaggerated, or simplified. So let's take a look. Oh, other art movements at this time. The main one that was happening during the abstract photography was the abstract expressionists, or the New York school, Jackson Pollock. So heavily influenced by the spontaneity of surrealism, first authentically American avant-garde movement, the abstract expressionists were only New York-based. And they believed art is non-representational and improvisational. So Jackson Pollock and his drip paintings. And take a look at Jackson Pollock's work and then some of these photographers. So Siskind is one of them, and he traveled with the abstract expressionists. He hung out with them. So this is some of the abstract expressionist painting. And take a look at some of the abstract photography I'm going to show you. We believe that Paul Strand was probably one of the earliest experimenters in abstract photography because he's so heavily focused on form. And very unique perspectives, not always showing the entire subject. Coburn, who was one of the pictorialists, also experimented. He called his images vortographs. And what he did is he arranged a series of mirrors on his lens to create a kaleidoscope effect. It was inspired by the movement called Vorticism, which is an offshoot of Cubism. And I'll show you an example of what Vorticism looked like in painting and design. This was their magazine, and this is what the paintings and drawings looked like. And here's his vortographs that he made through mirrors to look like kaleidoscopes with his camera. So this is as early as 1917. We also saw Laszlo Moholy-Nagy do abstract photography. So Laszlo Moholy-Nagy began to play with light and the camera. And this is some of his abstract photography in the 30s.
How did he make these images?
Some of these are long exposures on a tripod and moving light. Others, I don't know how he made all of them, but that's what some of those color ones were in the beginning.
He had colored lights.
Colored lights. Moving them in front of the camera. The enemy of photography is the convention, the fixed rules of how to do. The salvation comes from the experiment. Otto Steinert is another photographer who heavily experiments in abstract. He's a German, and it's a purely West German movement in response to the suppression of art by the Nazi Party. And here's some of his abstract photographs. There he is. Yes.
Do you think that abstract photography is popular these days?
Oh, yeah, the question is abstract photography popular these days? Absolutely. Again, this is another movement like straight photography that began in 1917 and still goes today. So we looked at Harry Callahan, one of the great street photographers, also worked heavily in abstract photography. So again, pay attention to the emphasis on form and shapes. Aaron Siskin, probably one of the most famous and I'll just say the most famous abstract photographers, because he traveled with the abstract expressionists, and he decided he was going to try to do with the camera what the abstract expressionists were doing with paint. And that was his goal. He set out to try to make abstract photographs. Photographed a lot of peeling paint, posters, graffiti, textures on walls. You can see tar on asphalt. The beauty of abstract photography is it leaves the viewer open to get from it whatever they may. It's not forcing or specifically communicating an opinion down your throat. It just leaves it open for imagination. Minor White. I don't know if he's necessarily considered an abstract photographer, but he heavily experimented with abstract. He was a real spiritualist. He was a Buddhist. And he was always trying to, with his camera, depict a realm beyond the one that we're living in. He was interested in spiritualism, simplicity, and peace in his work. Also a great photo educator. There he is. He has so many great quotes, it's hard to narrow them down. Be still with yourself until the object of your attention affirms your presence. Vision without association, pristine vision. No matter how slow the film's spirit always stands still long enough for the photographer it has chosen. So, the visual characteristics. Subject matter often hidden. Emphasis on form and experimentation. Okay, there's so many abstract photographers today. Adam Foose is one of them, who works purely with camera-less images. Here's some of his work. Abstract photography. There's a lot of experiment involved because you can't always predict what's going to happen. Udo Barth is a German photographer who works with soft focus. Emphasis on form. Wolfgang Tillmans, another German photographer. Abstract photography, we talked about this morning, the importance of play. It can be fun too, because you can just let go of your expectations and play with the camera. You can't always predict what you're going to get. That's what I just wanted to have you see, like an installation of how big one of his pieces would be.
How were they made? Those images show.
Wolfgang Tillmans, the question was how are they made? I don't know specifically on all of them, but he works a lot with photographic paper and developer without cameras as well. So rolling photographic paper over on itself, making marks on photographic paper. Susan Durgis is one who also works with abstract photography, often trying to mimic natural landscapes or natural forms. And I truly do not know a lot about her process. This is my work. This is my ode to abstract photography, photographing ice on my window. Yes?
I'm curious, as far as these various movements are concerned, were the movements defined by art historians and critics after, or did they understand enough that during the time that they were seeing this that it was defined?
That's a great question. Some of them were defined at the time. Pictorialism and photosuccessionist defined at the time. Straight photography and abstract photography, they aren't even movements, but I think they're events that were happening in photography that are very important. And then, of course, the constructivist, Dada, Surrealists, they were in a movement at the time. So I would say most of them were movements that were declared at the time. Yeah. So we see abstract photography weaving all the way from 1917 up to now. And the emphasis has always been on form and offering new visions of the world. Okay, so I'm not going to have time to delve into this one, but what I do want to say about this, I want to at least talk about new social landscape. I have like 2 minutes left. Postmodernism, like I said, I could talk about that forever. But I do want to talk about the new social landscape because that's really important. But all of these is happening around the 60s, 70s, and on. So the new social landscape photographers, this is 4 of them. Inevitably inspired by Walker Evans. But they were reinventing the documentary tradition, documenting the social landscape as the street photographers did, but with very little sentimentality. So I showed you Gary Winogrand. Robert Frank I showed you. So again, very little sentimentality. Lee Friedlander as well. So again, showing maybe the darker sides of American life. Diane Arbus, who was known to photograph freaks. Okay. And the reason this is important, these are the portrait photographers or the street photographers, but we see the same idea of focusing on the darker side of light move into landscape photography. Okay, so there's an exhibit called New Topographics, Photos of a Man-Altered Landscape, the George Eastman House, okay, focusing on the darker side of landscape photography. Meaning, instead of the glorified, beautiful vision of the modernists, the pristine Yosemite landscape, they start pointing the camera at the man-altered landscape. Okay, and these are 4 of the artists that were featured in this show. Okay, so Robert Adams starts to focus on what we're doing to the landscape and the suburban developments and the expansion out west in Colorado. Industrial complexes. Okay, so that darker view of the world, the Beckers who photographed all these leftover industrial towers in Germany. And of course, if you think about it, the 70s, this is happening about, right about the time of the first Earth Day, 60s, 70s, and the whole environmental movement. Stephen Shore starts taking this deadpan approach, sort of ironic approach to landscape with color. So this new way of photographing and documenting people in the landscape would influence generations of photographers to come. The deadpan approach, the refusal of a need for beauty, and showing the banal or absurd aspect of life would then influence postmodernism. And you guys, postmodernism, again, could be an entire year. Let me just see if I have one more slide there. So I can't really talk about that now because we're finishing up, but postmodernism started about in the 60s and 70s, and it was influenced by things like The Happenings with Yoko Ono, and some of the abstract expressionist action paintings. Okay, and in postmodernism we see installation art, performance art, environmental art, light art, conceptual art, where the idea is more important than the photograph itself. Okay, and we don't really even know, is postmodernism done or are we still living in it now? Okay, so much of the art we see now that's so much about the idea or about performance or installation, that's postmodernism. Okay, and postmodernism, where all of these have their specific characteristics, postmodernism has basically taken everything that has come before, mixed it up, thrown it up in the air and gone, see what falls? Okay, I'm gonna grab that, I'm gonna grab that, I'm gonna grab that. And I'm gonna communicate a specific idea. So that's generally, in a nutshell, postmodernism. But it's the art that you see today. Some people would say anything goes. But more importantly is look at how much the camera has come into play in the art worlds and the movements today. Okay? They couldn't have done it without the camera. Environmental art, light art, and performance art all has to be recorded by the camera for you to see it, right? Artists like Andy Goldsworthy, okay? All right, everyone, thank you for listening. I just wanted to say, just think of these movements and figure out which one is singing to you, and then try to infuse some of that in your work, and maybe that could send you on a direction for a while. Thank you. Thank you.
For more information, please visit us online, give us a call, or stop by our New York City Superstore. You can also connect with us on the web.